start to record. So, hi. So, economic integration is discussed today. So, what is economic integration? So, what is being seen is that a lot of countries are now coming together and sort of forming these integration, such as your European Union, or for example your NAFTA, which is North American free trade agreements, and so on. These kind of like formal integrations with countries are sort of removing sort of trade barriers. So they're removing trade barriers, and they're trying to sort of act as one single region. They're trying to sort of do that in order to basically improve not only trade, international trade, but also trying to sort of merge or deregulate things like financial markets, things like, for example, free movement of financial capital, also free movement of sometimes people, free movement of sometimes even resources, and so on. Why are they doing this? And the answer is very simple. The answer is that this allows the market to become larger. So if I'm a producer in, for example, Spain, now I'm not only selling in Spain because of the European Union, I'm selling it in Italy, I'm selling it in different countries, and so on. Now, remember, right now, Britain is doing the Brexit. So one would argue this case is a really world coming together, integrating, given that how Britain is breaking apart, or breaking out from the European Union and all that. And the answer is just that a lot of people think that Britain should not do that. However, it's their decision, and they've decided to do that. So today's discussion is all about basically discussing what these economic integrations are. So we'll discuss various forms of economic integration. We will also discuss in this class today um, things like, for example, um, what are the impact of such kind of economic integrations? Like, for example, when you look at NAFTA, which is North American Free Trade Agreement, there's Mercosur, which is in the sort of Latin American countries. There is in Asia, you have seen ASEAN happening, or APAC happening. In Africa, you have COMESA happening. These are countries coming together and trying to sort of have regional trade to happen. So all of this we'll discuss today. But before we talk about um, what the impact is, let's talk about what are the various sort of forms of economic integration. The first form of economic integration is free trade area. So let's discuss free trade area. So what we'll do is let's write types of economic integration, right? And the first thing I want to talk about is what we call, number one is free trade area. So free trade area. So what is free trade area? In a free trade area, basically, let's say Pakistan, okay? Let's say Pakistan and Sri Lanka decides to have a free trade area with each other. This means that Pakistan will remove all trade barriers with Sri Lanka. So there will be completely free trade that will happen between Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Now, this also means that if Sri Lanka has a free trade agreement with India, while Pakistan puts a trade barrier on India, then this will be still allowed, which means to say that when two countries are forming a free trade area, they can remove all the trade barriers between each other. And that does also mean that if Pakistan has a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka has a free trade agreement with India, then Pakistan may not need to also have a free trade agreement with India, which means all countries may have a separate trade agreement with any non-member. Haris, let me start quickly. I'm saying this, that we're doing economic integration. And what is economic integration? When countries are trying to sort of integrate with each other by removing trade barriers or something or the other. One of the first form of economic integration we talk about is what we call free trade area, in which two or more countries, they form an agreement with each other of free trade. And once they sign that agreement, they're allowed to, if free trade happens with both the countries, there is no trade restriction whatsoever. However, each country is also allowed to have a separate trade agreement with any non-member. It's not bounding on the members in a free trade area to have the same agreement with the non-member. You can have a different agreement with the non-member. So India ke saath, agar Pakistan is actually has a trade barrier, is not trading with India, for example, and Sri Lanka is having a free trade agreement with India, it will still be okay for Pakistan to do so because they are part of free trade area. Okay, so if you read this, two or more countries can form a free trade area if tariffs and non-tariff barriers between members are abolished or agreed to be phased out, but each member maintains its own tariff on imports from non-member countries, which means no common trade policy exists. So therefore, I'm saying this, that you are allowed to have free trade with members, and basically with non-members. For example, if Pakistan and Sri Lanka are the members of that free trade area and India is non-members, with non-members you have what we call a different, you're allowed to have a different trade policy. You don't need to have a common trade policy. Okay, so that's what we call a free trade area. And a good example of this is NAFTA, which is between the US, Mexico, and Canada. Now, if Mexico has a different agreement with, for example, Pakistan, US can also have a different agreement with Pakistan. They don't need all of these guys to do not need to have the same agreement. They can be different agreement. Okay, but that's something which we'll soon see, which is not found in custom union. Okay, are we good to move on? Is there any question before we move on? Let's move on to custom union. In a custom union, what we say, it is like one notch. Look at this, guys. It's one notch from up from a free trade, which means what you have is basically free trade with members. Okay, you have free trade with members, but you also have a common external trade policy. So what do we mean by this? Let's say Pakistan and Sri Lanka now form a custom union. If Pakistan and Sri Lanka decides to form a custom union, basically they are saying this, say, let's have free trade between us, but also this custom union means now we have a common external policy with India. So now both might have, if Pakistan says let's put a tariff on India, Sri Lanka may also put a tariff on India, because now they are part of the common, the custom union. So custom union basically is a notch above, where it says that no trade barriers among the members, or no tariffs, no quotas among the members, but also common external tariff wall is set up against the non-member nation, and therefore you're trying to basically encourage more trade between the partners. Look at this, guys. If you look at free trade area, there could be a possibility that the trade happens between these two countries, but also trade between India and Sri Lanka may stay strong. But when you are part of custom union, you are now basically making both these countries to have strong trade with each other, and restrict trade with another country like India by putting what we call a common external trade policy. So you are now acting as one rather than two different entities. Does that make sense, guys? So in a common custom union, it's called free trade area plus common external trade policy. That's why it's a notch above the free trade area. Am I going to move on? Does that make sense, everyone? Guys, from here we move on to what we call common market. A common market, again, is a notch above custom union. So in a common market, basically what we're doing is this. Let's read this note. uh, in a common market, countries within custom unions may wish to move the next stage by extending the degree of cooperation, and the way they do that is that there is an unrestricted factor flow. So common market basically means, let me write this. Common market basically means it's a custom union plus free flow of labor and capital. In other words, what we are saying is this, that any people, any good, any service can easily move. So for example, if I'm part of common market, if I'm Italian, can I work in Spain? And the answer is yes, I can totally work in Spain, or I could invest in Spain. I could buy Spanish companies' shares without any trouble, because now not only free trade is allowed, also common external tariff is allowed, but there's also free flow of people, free flow of money, and free flow of goods to be allowed. So, in other words, common market takes it one notch above, where it basically builds up from a free trade to custom union to now common market, where you now allow even people to move from one country to another without. So for example, if Pakistani decides to work in the US, you need a work permit. Does that happen in a common market? And the answer is, in a common market it doesn't happen. In a common market, you're allowed, as long as you are part of the common market citizen, you're part of the common market citizenship, you don't have to worry about getting a work permit. Does that make sense? So in a common market, you're now making trade to become one notch above. Any questions, guys? No questions? Are we going to move on? So it's one notch above. It also allows free flow of labor and capital. Okay. Now we move on to the next thing, which is called economic and monetary union. Um, if you have any questions, this is the time to ask. Please ask me if you have any question. Is basically what we call economic and monetary union. So basically, so far, if you quick summary, because a lot of people are like joining in right now. So we had a free trade area where there was no common external trade policy. Then came your custom union, where you have a common external trade policy along with no trade barriers. Then came common market, where there was custom union plus you had free trade of movement between people. Um, see, Amar, the difference between these two is that in a custom union, you don't have you don't have you don't have a free flow of labor and capital. In a custom union, you have common external trade policy, plus you have common external trade policy, plus you have no trade barrier. But in a common market, you also have what we call free flow of people and labor and capital and so on and so forth. So that's why it's one notch above. Then came what we call two kinds of sort of union. Sometimes it's called monetary union. In a monetary union, basically what you do is that you say that it is common market, common market plus common currency. So you are basically not only making your common market to happen, but there is also what we call a monetary union, where you try to sort of come up with the same currencies. For example, euro is the currency of many countries in Europe, which means whichever countries have euro, they are part of the monetary union. And monetary union basically means that you may, because you have the same currency, you basically have the same central bank. There's one single bank of these countries, from France to Italy to Spain, all those countries that have euro, they have the same central bank. So same monetary policy, money policies. Monetary policy is something which we'll see in a chapter, our last chapter. So same monetary policy, will be followed. So these policies are basically making the countries to now completely work together and act like a similar regional blocks. Now, the difference between monetary union and economic union is this: that in an economic union, you may have a possibility that not only you are making your, so basically कभी कभार ऐसा होता है कि you may have the same currency, और कभी कभार ऐसा होता है economic union में you may not have the same currency. If you have the same currency in an economic union, then you also form a monetary union. But if you have a different currency in an economic union, basically this is where we say we are moving beyond the common market. And this in an economic union is when the members of a common market, so basically you start with common market, make additional provisions for the harmonization of certain macroeconomic and regulatory policies. So basically an economic union is equal to common market plus more, and that more means number one is you have common tax rates. So all countries follow same tax rates in terms of not only goods and services but also salaries and income. Then they have common laws and regulations that provide the environment for production, employment and trade. ऐसा नहीं होगा कि if UK is taxing, I mean, let's say if Italy is taxing its workers 50%, Spain will also will be doing the same if they're part of economic union. Also, if beyond this they add common currency as well, then they become a monetary union. So basically, common market is European economic union is common market plus what we call common policies and tax rates. Okay, so that's the summary. Okay, so in a free trade area, if I could give you a quick sort of a revision, in a free trade area, countries are simply removing trade barriers among each other. In a custom union, they do it in such a manner that it is no trade barriers with each other. So there is custom union is free trade plus common external trade policy, which means all countries which are part of custom union, when they will put a tariff on a non-member. Okay, while a common market will basically mean it is custom union plus more. What is the plus more? It's free movement of people and all your factors of production. I mean, land to ho nahi sakta, but let's say labor and capital, right? While economic union is basically common market plus, I wrote this here, common market plus common policies and common tax rates. So I'm going to write that here. While monetary union is basically your economic union plus similar, or I'm sorry, not similar, plus same currency. Okay, so that's the total sort of story of these economic sort of integration. One thing which I want to quickly discuss is simply, why do we need the same currency? What's the advantage of the same currency that I want to talk about, because that's an important discussion. Sometimes it comes in MCQs. They say, why do we need same currency? Before I talk about that, I just want to ask you guys quickly if you have questions, because if you do, great, we can answer it right now. Otherwise, we can move on to discussion of what are the advantages of monetary union. Well, if you have the same currency, sometimes this comes in MCQs, guys. What's the advantage of having the same currency or having a what we call a monetary union? And I'm saying here that number one, you have basically lower transaction costs. So for example, if Pakistan has to trade with US, first Pakistani rupees are converted into dollar, and that's how trade happens between Pakistan and sort of US. If Pakistan and US have the same currency, then there is basically no transaction cost. The transaction cost will not be there. Why? Because then the same currency is used. You don't need to convert your rupees into dollar because your country also has, let's say, dollar as a currency. So currency conversion doesn't take place, which is basically a loss of sort of value that happens. So number one, there is um, reduction in transaction cost that happens because we have the same currency. Secondly, it's easier to basically compare prices and there's more price transparency. So easier comparison can happen. So for example, if you're in Italy and you buy a bottle of water and let's say it's for €1, but let's say you go to Paris and you buy that same bottle for €2, the only reason is because France is more expensive. The cost of living in France is more than the cost of living in Italy. So the idea goes is that uh, that kind of comparison is pretty easy when you are paying in the same currency. Does that make sense, guys? So the idea goes this: when you have the same currency, there is an ease in terms of greater price transparency, and also the fact that you are doing the trade in the same currency. There's sometimes no exchange rate risk. So basically, a lot of times, sometimes people lose out money because of exchange rate risk. What is the exchange rate risk? Let's say if I'm buying my goods from or I'm selling my goods to the US, okay? And right now, and the exchange rate goes basically up for Pakistan. If the exchange rate goes up, exports become expensive. And that is basically where I may lose out my customers because they'll be like, hey, I was buying the good from you, but your goods have now become expensive because the exchange rate has gone up. And I may not want to buy with you again because of the higher price. That kind of exchange rate risk may not happen if you're buying in the same currency. So many advantages of having the same currency. Number one is there is zero transaction cost because you're not really converting cash. Number two, there is price transparency. Things are very easy to compare. Number three, uh, there is also no exchange risk basically because you're buying and selling in the same currency. But there are, of course, some drawbacks as well. And one of the biggest drawbacks is that countries, when they form a monetary union, they may not have any independent monetary policy. Suddenly, they don't have their own policies. They can't basically have what we call uh, autonomy, as we call it. So if you're Greece, right, you don't have that kind of an autonomy that you otherwise will have uh, when you are as an independent company, independent sort of country who has its own currency. Also, fiscal policy and economic policies, macro policies. So monetary and fiscal policies are interlinked. So we'll soon see there's also a possibility of you losing out on your fiscal policies because of the fact that you don't have that freedom. Fawaz is asking me a question. He says, another advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you view it, could be how strong economies benefit from a weaker exchange rate and weak economies suffer from it. I agree with you. Sometimes one country maybe also Greece is a great example. How Greece was part of this European Union and how Greece was basically an economy not doing too well, and all other countries were complaining of why do we have to carry the burden of Greece because of the performance of Greece, other countries were getting affected too. So sometimes one country's bad sort of actions can affect, or weaker economy can affect you because you're part of the economic union. So there are pros and cons of this that can happen when you have this. But guys, these MCQs in MCQs you will see this kind of paragraph to be tested, or it could be part of data response as well. Does that make sense, guys? Now I want to look at your evaluation of trading blocks or pros and cons of trading block, or basically, let me write this: evaluation of trading blocks. Okay, there are some evaluation of trading blocks. Basically, what are the two things that can happen? One, we can say they could be trade creation. Another one is what we call trade diversion to happen. So this is something which I want to explain to you guys. Comes a lot in exams. What is trade creation? So the trade creation is basically when trade moves away from an inefficient domestic producer to an efficient member of the, let's say, custom union. Okay, what do we mean by this? Let's say UK was buying goods from Spain, but at the same time, UK was putting a tariff of $5. Now, when Spain and UK become part of trade union, will this tariff stay? And the answer is no. So before trade sort of before economic integration, let me write this. Before economic integration, we saw that UK was putting a tariff on Spain of $5. So let's say the price of the good was, let's say, $10, and UK was putting a tariff of $5. So the total price was $15. In terms of a graph, it looks like this. In terms of a graph, we will see that, again, this is my demand supply. I'm sorry, I'm just making it very quickly. This is demand supply, and this is the Spanish price, the PW price was $10. You're putting a tariff, you're making it PW plus T, you're making it go to $15, right? So this is what you are doing. And as a result of that, you are restricting trade, because trade could be Q2 minus Q1, but because you were putting a tariff, now it's Q3 minus Q4. So you have restricted trade to happen. But the good thing about custom union or custom union is when you're putting this custom union, or when you're putting any economic integration, this tariff will be removed. When you remove this tariff, you are basically moving away from a high cost, because when you are putting a tariff, there was this Q4 minus Q1 domestic producers to produce more who were inefficient to start off with. When you remove this tariff, so removal of tariff will basically result in more imports to happen, which is Q2 minus Q1, and the inefficient domestic producer, which is Q4 minus Q1, inefficient domestic producer will now be replaced by the efficient international producer. And that basically means you are creating trade to happen. You are making the more efficient producer to produce more. So if I read the paragraph, guys, just, and I'll go back to the diagram, that in a trade creation basically refers to an increase in imports that displaces less efficient domestic producer, or production. The elimination of the internal trade barriers will lead to members to import from another country that were previously produced domestically. This increases efficiency since production shifts away from higher cost domestic producer to a lower cost foreign producer, leading to fewer scarce resources being wasted. So we say that trade moves away from a high cost inefficient producer domestically to a low cost efficient producer internationally. Isn't that bad for the country's domestic? It is bad for country's domestic production, but from an economic efficiency perspective, it is not so bad. And the reason is very simple. It's not bad because you are basically not causing any deadweight losses to happen. Look at this, guys. पहले क्या हो रहा था? पहले अगर आप देखें तो ये पूरा एरिया आपका, ये पूरा आपका एरिया 1 2 3 4 था जो आपने लूज करे थे बिकॉज कंज्यूमर सरप्लस आपका गिर रहा था, प्राइस बढ़ रही थी. नाउ दिस इज नॉट गोना हैपन. All this area is going to go back to consumers. Consumer surplus will go up by this shaded region. So is this bad for the domestic consumers? No. Is it bad for the domestic producers? And the answer is yes. Is it good for economic efficiency? Yes. And that's why, in the greater benefit of economic efficiency, one could argue that this is good. And so, one of the positives of a trading block is that it allows trade to move. So let me. I wrote this here. In fact, it allows trades to move away from an inefficient or high-cost domestic producer to an efficient member of the custom union. So you are basically having low or higher sort of consumer surplus. You allow sort of more efficiency and so on. So can this cause dependency for a country? Of course, yes. Anytime you're trading with another country, basically you can cause things to. I mean, you can become dependent on another country. Yes. Yes, I agree with you. There will be basically lower sort of uh, lower domestic production, and therefore there will be definitely lower employment. But remember, guys, if you are an economic sort of economist, you will say that countries should basically use resources efficiently. And this clearly, by the way, when you are putting trade barriers on a country, you are not using economic resources properly. Yes, of course, there will be higher unemployment, but all of this makes sense because this basically allow more trade to happen between countries. Does that make sense? For example, if you are benefiting uh, um, um, if you're benefiting one country, the other country may benefit you. So you are basically promoting each other in the various sectors that you are good at. Okay, so that's why we say this is actually good news for trade to happen. Now there's a negative as well. I want to move on to negativity in one or negative impact, which is called trade diversion. But there is a question by Abdul Habib. He's saying Q1 is efficient international producers. Guys, Q1 where when you put a tariff, trade went to, now domestic production goes to Q4. So Q4 minus Q1 are these inefficient producers who are now producing more when you put a tariff. But when you remove the tariff, now these Q4 minus Q1 domestic producers will not be selling the good. Does that make sense? So that kind of become an advantage for for everyone. You need to. Does that make sense, guys? Just 1 minute of pause. I'm just going to come back in 1 minute. But basically, to recap this, when you are looking at a trade creation, you are basically moving trade away from inefficient domestic producers because before joining a custom union, you might be putting a tariff of someone. After joining a custom union, if you remove that tariff, clearly domestic producers will who are producing because of tariff will now no longer produce. So you trade, there will be more efficiency that will take place, and that is good news for trade. And that is good news from an economic perspective. But that may cause, of course, local domestic unemployment to go up as domestic production will fall. But let's look at trade diversion. Trade diversion is when trade moves away from an efficient non-member to an inefficient member. So it's a bit complicated. And I want to explain this through numbers. And these numbers will be important because a lot of questions in terms of MCQs test our knowledge of trade diversion. So what I'm saying is this, that one of the downsides of sort of economic integration is when trade moves away from an efficient non-member to an inefficient member. So what do we mean by this? Let's explain this through examples. Okay. The example that I want to give you guys is, let's just move on a little lower. So let's say UK can buy from either Spain or from Thailand. Okay. And let's say Spain has a price of $10 for a good. Okay. But Thailand has a price of, for example, $7 for a good. Clearly, Thailand is the one who's a low cost sort of producer. And let's say the government decides to put a tariff on Thailand, but do not put a tariff on Spain, because Spain and UK. So UK plus Spain, they form what we call a custom union. And as a result, Thailand decides to put a tariff of $5. So this is your tariff. When UK decides to put a tariff on Thailand, the price will now be not 7 anymore, which will be 7 plus 5, yani 12. Clearly, Spain, that is an inefficient producer, will now produce more. Why? Because previously, before you form a custom union, you will always buy from Thailand, because Thailand is giving you something for a low price, as low as, like, for example, $7, but Spain gives you for $10. But when you remove the tariff, or when you put a tariff on Thailand, you are basically making Thailand to remain expensive, like $12, and you will now buy from Spain, because after the custom union, Spain becomes the cheaper producer. But is Spain more efficient than Thailand? And the answer is no. But the fact that you've put a tariff on Thailand, you are moving trade away. Look at this, guys. You are moving trade away from an efficient non-member like Thailand to an inefficient sort of member like Spain, and that is basically a downside uh, an economic union, where you are basically buying more from an inefficient producer. The question we need to ask is, why is UK buying more from Spain? And the answer is very simple. UK is buying more from Spain is because probably Spain is buying more from UK for one good, where UK might be not efficient, but basically both of them are sketching each other's back, and as a result, both of them are promoting efficiency in one sector or the other. Does that make sense, guys? Are we good? So economic integration is the plus of it, where you are moving away from an inefficient domestic producer to an efficient foreign producer, while trade diversion is the bad sort of a trading block, where you are moving away from an efficient non-member to an inefficient member within the custom union. Um, so trade diversion arises when import shifts away from an efficient non-member to a less efficient member due to preference the latter enjoys. The remaining external tariff only for non-members may render some members artificially cheaper in the production of the good. Another member will then switch to importing from truly efficient and low-cost non-member like Thailand to an artificially cheaper member like Spain. Basically, Spain become an artificially cheaper country, and that is because you are not putting a tariff on them, while you put a tariff on Thailand to make them artificially more expensive. So that's the pros and cons of your trading block. So I'm done with today's class, guys. This is a discussion for today. Tomorrow is a very important discussion. It's going to be on terms of trade, but today's discussion will end here. But I'm willing to take questions now for the next 3 minutes. I'm going to take questions, but I'm going to also pause recording.